The Old Testament is an enigmatic work. It is both a book of ancient history and a collection of rules that gave birth to a religion, Judaism. It is also the source of Christianity and, several centuries later, inspired the Quran, Islam's founding text. Its characters have accompanied the West for over 2,000 years. Our imaginations have been carried away by its stories. But what exactly is contained in this book? Where was it written, and by whom? Modern science has shone a new light on these questions on the basis of findings drawn from stones and from the land. A recent revolution in the area of archaeology has transformed the idea we once had of the society that put the Old Testament into writing. The investigation we are about to carry out was triggered by this revolution. The sun rises over the lands of Canaan, lands where, according to the Bible, lived the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Our investigation is about to begin, at the beginning. Their stories are told in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Israel Finkelstein, a researcher at the Archeology Institute of the University of Tel Aviv, has had joint charge of excavations in Megiddo in the north of Israel for almost 10 years. About 100 specialists and volunteers from all over the world are involved in this undertaking. Megiddo is the jewel of biblical archaeology. Its history goes back over 7 millenniums of contacts and conflicts between the great powers that dominated the region in turn: Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon, followed by the Persian Empire. Megiddo is a tell, an artificial hill created from layers of homes, palaces, and temples that were built over each other during the centuries. The name Megiddo is often cited in the Bible. For Christians, it represents Armageddon, the site of the apocalypse. Many archaeological expeditions have been embarked upon on the basis of these biblical references. In 1903, the German archaeologist Gottlieb Schumacher organized the first digs here. vast quantities of material. In the 1920s to 30s, U.S. billionaire John Rockefeller financed an archaeological mission by the University of Chicago. The mission was aimed at carrying out a methodical investigation. Thanks to the hundreds of workers recruited at the site or in Egypt, the mission was able to reach bedrock in this huge trench, which measures 20 meters in width and is 15 meters deep.
This is a key for understanding the history of Megiddo and the history of the entire country. It is a unique opportunity which was given to us by earlier excavators. There's this incredible section going all the way down to bedrock, giving you a history of about 7,000 years, from bedrock down there all the way up to the 5th century BC. 20 strata, in fact more than that, 25 cities built one on top of the other. A unique situation. There's nothing like that anywhere else in the entire region, even beyond the borders of this country. And this opens a window for us into the belly of the mound and a window into the book, open book, the history of Megiddo in the Bronze and Iron Ages, and the history not only of Megiddo, the history of the entire country.
An unparalleled site that is the cradle of biblical archaeology, Megiddo serves as a reference for the dating of sites throughout the whole of the Near East. Located at a strategic and economic crossroads between Egypt, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, Megiddo is going to play a crucial role in our investigation. The Old Testament is the name commonly given to the Hebraic Bible. It is essentially a religious book. For many centuries, it was considered as being unnecessary and even dangerous to question the historical events related in its pages. This attitude would change as a result of what are known as the Lights. The Bible would undergo a rereading on the basis of tools provided by science and reason.
Mid-19th century Germany saw a critical exegesis of the Bible, which triggered reactions particularly in England. This ultimately led scholars to come to Palestine in an attempt to use archaeology in order to prove the historical veracity of the biblical texts.
Researchers, most often from European and U.S. religious circles, worked throughout the region looking for evidence to prove the historical nature of the Bible. They included Fathers Lagrange, Abel, and Vincent. Edward Robinson, a theologian trained in the Semitic languages, identified dozens of sites that have retained practically the same names for 2,500 years. These adventurers drew up the first biblical maps of the Holy Land. Little by little, methodical excavations were set up in the area. According to an expression popular at the time, the archaeologists carried a spade in one hand and a Bible in the other. They were the originators of both a method and a state of mind, biblical archaeology.
It would take quite some time before biblical archaeology fell out of favor. As late as the 1930s, the American archaeologist William Foxwell Albright was convinced that his archaeological research would enable him to prove the historical veracity of the Bible. And this movement continued practically until 1960.
The approach has still not completely disappeared. But in recent years, researchers have opened up a new path that has transformed archaeology into an independent scientific discipline. These specialists consider architectural vestiges, ceramics, and debris of all types as the elements in a huge tableau vivant, a human reality that has to be sampled, understood, and interpreted in scientific terms.
He was very satisfied that the trough is still in place. He thinks that it's nice and it should be kept in place. It's this one over here, this trough.
How has this new approach changed what we know about the origins of the Old Testament? This is the investigation being carried out by Israel Finkelstein in Megiddo and in the Levant's archaeological sites. Allowing these books of stone to shed light on a work of paper. The Bible is the world's most widely read book. Its specialists include exegetes, epigraphs, specialists in literature, linguists, historians, and theologians. Thomas Romer is a professor of the Old Testament at the Lausanne Faculty of Theology. He will be our guide with respect to this work.
What is the Hebraic Bible? First of all, it is obviously the founding text of Judaism. It is also the text that is at the origin of three monotheisms: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In more precise terms, it is the history of the Hebraic people, a national history that begins with the patriarchs and goes through to the royalty. But this national history also became a universal history through the prophets and by being opened up to other nations. So the Hebraic Bible is both a very specific book related to the Hebraic people and, due to its acceptance and enlargement, a book that carries a universal message.
The Old Testament is composed of a series of books, which is the very definition of the word Bible, ta biblia, which in Greek means the books. It is a collection of legal texts, poems, and moral reflections, and a history book of the creation of the world and the people of Israel. It was the first book ever to be printed. Like all great religious texts, it is a controversial document that has been used by some to justify wars and invasions, and by others to deliver a message of peace. Its wealth is such that it is never far from the minds of our archaeologists. It is not possible to carry out digs in the Holy Land without being conscious of the gravity of the situation. Israel Finkelstein, an archaeologist, and Neil Silverman, a historian, have decided to write a book together that will compare the discoveries made by archaeology with the most famous of biblical stories. They know they are embarking on a very sensitive mission.
The Bible, of course, is one of our most important ancient Near Eastern texts, but it's got a larger significance than that, obviously. It's a ancient text that is the core of the religion of hundreds of millions of people all over the world. So we are aware of the sensitivities of the Bible, but what we're trying to do is bring the most modern discoveries, the best insights that we can, to help the understanding and really transform the modern understanding of what the Bible really represents in its ancient context.
Their book provides the outline for our investigation and its chronology, from the most distant times to the most recent periods.
Voilà un des volumes de cette Bible ancienne du XVIIe siècle imprimée à Londres, les polyglottes que vous souhaitiez.
The first 5 books of the Old Testament make up what is called the Pentateuch, or the Torah in Hebrew. They are particularly important for those who proclaim monotheism and are common to both Judaism and Christianity.
The Hebraic Bible begins with a universal story. The first 11 chapters tell the story of creation, the creation of human beings and the world, and also the origin of violence. Cain and Abel, the flood, and the origin of the diversity of our languages and of humanity in the Tower of Babel. Then suddenly in chapter 12 we turn to something else, the story of Abraham and thus the origins of the Hebraic people, with this call that Abraham receives from God.
ויאמר אדוני אל אברהם, לך לך מארצך וממולדך ומבית אביך אל הארץ אשר אראך.
The Lord said unto Abraham, leave this land and your ancestors, the house of your father, and go to the land that I will show you.
The Bible describes the patriarch Abraham, his wife Sarah, and his nephew Lot leaving their land with their herds and heading for the Promised Land in response to a divine order. The biblical text describes a veritable migration over thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia toward Egypt and then Canaan. In accordance with the Romantic and Orientalist conceptions of the period, 20th century researchers imagined Abraham as a Bedouin, similar to those that could then be seen in the Holy Land. According to them, the biblical story described a lifestyle that was typical of the region.
When scholars sought a date for the biblical patriarchs, they basically relied on a certain number of elements contained in the texts that took us back to around 1800 BC. This obviously means that they relied only on biblical facts and not on facts that were external to the Bible. Even today, many people imagine that Abraham lived around 1800 BC.
1800 BC is a period referred to by archaeologists as the Middle Bronze Age. We have to go back to Megiddo. What can the Book of Stone tell us about this? We will focus our investigation in the heart of the site, on the strata dating from the Middle Bronze Age. By going down to the lower pages of Megiddo, Israel Finkelstein takes us back in time. He arrives at the ruins of the city that corresponds to the second millennium. What he finds there is surprising. At that time, Megiddo was an important administrative, cultural, and economic center with monumental buildings, fortifications, and temples. Far from being an arid landscape suitable only for herders, the strata of the period corresponding to Abraham's migration reveal a city-state of almost 2,000 inhabitants. At that time, Canaan was an economically developed region with a very dense network of city-states. Doubts are raised about the chronology that has been proposed by traditional interpretations of the Bible. But what of the migration itself? Canaan is a buffer zone situated between Egypt and Mesopotamia, and these empires have left a number of vestiges. Megiddo is one of the sites where such material abounds. This Book of Stone will allow us to read the ancient pages of the history of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Pages that are indispensable to the rest of our investigation. In Canaan, archaeology is for the large part a science of broken fragments and shattered vases. Their decorative style, dating, and use are elements that come together like a huge puzzle in order to reconstruct these societies. These fragments teach us about the origin of power and the social groups active at that time. They suggest both distant and near influences, desires, fears, and daily life from the relevant time. Like these small engraved cylinders that were used as seals or amulets, and in which we can see the rites that were then popular in Mesopotamia and the Levant unfolding before our eyes.
At Megiddo, we have evidence for the influence of the northern powers, the northern civilizations, I mean Mesopotamian and Syrian, throughout history, from the late 4th millennium to the 1st millennium BC. This means that they had an impact on the events in the Levant throughout, and that it is impossible to reconstruct the history of this region without taking into consideration the northern civilizations, Mesopotamian and Syrian.
There are many links in the stories of the patriarchs with the people of the north, that is, the Arameans. We have Jacob and his uncle Laban, who ended up there, and we can see that they have family ties there, as well as more complicated conflictual links. Territories had to be mapped out, and it was not always an easy task. The north is also mentioned when Abraham is about to leave, as he comes from Haran, which was a very important Aramaic town.
The biblical text describes the migration of Abraham as a break with his own civilization. But is the hypothesis that the patriarchs originated in Mesopotamia a plausible one? One of the answers lies perhaps in the countless archives and testimonials of Mesopotamian civilization that are today to be found disseminated throughout the world's greatest museums. We have here a panorama of the civilization and empires that followed one another in Mesopotamia over the millenniums. Alongside these monuments that rise up from the sands, we find thousands of tablets covered in cuneiform symbols, writings in clay that cover several thousands of years, some of which date from the second millennium BC. Will Neil Silberman be able to find the traces of Abraham's story in these tablets? The thousands of tablets dug up from the silt of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers form a gigantic database that has to be deciphered, a task that is still ongoing. In the 1920s, an English archaeologist, Leonard Woolley, began digs at Ur, the village where Abraham originated. A number of clues appeared to be quite conclusive. William Albright, a U.S. scholar, believed that he had identified the historical framework for the patriarch's story. He claimed that a vast migration, that of the Amorites, a nomadic people from Mesopotamia, led to the destruction of urban culture in the Levant around 2000 BC. Neil Silberman is at the School of Applied Higher Studies in Paris.
The early scholars attempted to place Abraham in a historic context of the Amorite invasions. But do we believe that this could be true today?
The Amorites are a people that are well documented at the end of the third and beginning of the second millenniums, and it was very tempting to link Abraham's migration with that of the Amorites. However, the Amorite migrations primarily occurred in a west-east direction, whereas Abraham, in contrast, went from east to west. As a consequence, the link is not as obvious as was once thought.
It now appears to be well accepted. There was no migration in the direction of Canaan at the time that the Bible situates Abraham's voyage. But new discoveries in the ruins of Mari and Nuzi relaunched the investigation on Abraham. Over 20,000 cuneiform tablets have been excavated in Mari. They contain certain biblical names, such as Yasmach El, which could be Ishmael, Yaqub El for Jacob, and most importantly, Abiram for Abraham.
For a long time, it was thought that the name of Abraham could be linked to the period around 1800, when the name was cited in a certain number of texts. However, the sudden increase in the number of texts available meant that there was clear evidence that the name was widely used not only around 1800, but in the centuries that followed. So there was no real proof of the relevant time period for this biblical patriarch.
As the tablets were gradually deciphered, new theories appeared, most of which tried to prove the existence of Abraham in the second millennium BC. John Van Seters, an internationally recognized expert, has been working on the Nuzi tablets for a long time. The tablets contain a story similar to that of Sarah, Abraham's barren wife in the Bible.
how to account for a barren woman who gives her maidservant to her husband in order to bear children for her. Something of this kind seemed to show up in the Nuzi tablets. And so the scholar said, aha, here we have something. Here we have a way of linking Abraham with this particular period. And this was very attractive, but there were some problems. The problems was that scholars were so concentrated on the documents of the second millennium that they forgot to look at the documents in the first millennium. And when one looked through the same kind of literature, the same kind of archival documents of the first millennium, the same customs show up in these texts. Taking all of these things together, they really prove absolutely nothing. There's just no firm evidence that can pin down the patriarchs and Abraham into a particular period in the second millennium.
In this way, traditional biblical archaeology reached a dead end in terms of the Abraham story.
So what we see is that the whole concept of roaming the land with the Bible in one hand and the spade in another in order to look for the patriarchs doesn't work. In a domino effect, one theory after the other collapse. So the problem is not in this theory or that theory. The problem is in the way of thinking, in the concept. The idea of old traditional biblical archaeology does not work, is wrong. And I think that now we have to go back to the text, to the book of Genesis, in order to understand the reality of the period of the patriarchs on the background of the period of the writing.
Nevertheless, the Old Testament can still be used by historians. It suffices to know how to identify the clues contained in the book, the names of places or people, typical landscapes. In the book of Genesis, reference is made to the Philistines, a people who came to Canaan and who made life difficult for the Israelites. What do we know of the Philistines? That they are part of a group of peoples whose origin is unknown, who came to the coastal plains of the Levant and who were given the name the Sea Peoples. Neil Silberman met with an Israeli archaeologist in digs in Dor, not far from Megiddo, a site that relates to these Sea Peoples. She is trying to identify them and determine their date of arrival.
What can we say about the date of the arrival of the Philistines and the other Sea Peoples?
Well, other than the Bible, when they are mentioned earlier, both archaeologically and if we take into consideration the literature, they appear on the scene in the 12th century BC. It's roughly 1200 or 1150 BC.
So in the earlier periods, when it's mentioned in connection with Abraham, there's just not archaeological evidence. Everything comes later.
No, none whatsoever. Archaeologically, everything starts in the 12th. Some would say a little bit earlier, maybe the late 13th century.
The biblical verses that associate the patriarchs with the Philistines presuppose a world that dates from after the 12th century BC. Let us continue with our investigation. The stories of the Bible often refer to camels. There are 25 references to this animal in Genesis, most of which have some connection with Abraham. Camels were obviously a well-known animal in the Near East, and archaeological excavations have revealed significant quantities of camel bones. But our objective is to put a date on these events. Israel Finkelstein has gone to see Ladar Sapir of the University of Tel Aviv's Archaeozoological Laboratory.
What do we know about the domestication of the camel in the Levant region?
According to the archaeological evidence, the camel could not have been domesticated as a beast of burden before the first millennium BC.
A second piece of evidence has therefore arisen that contradicts the biblical texts. The camels of the Near East were not used as working animals before 1000 BC. Before this period, we can find no trace or representation of this animal on vases, ceramics, or monumental decors. But our investigation doesn't end there. The presence of camels is linked to the caravan trade from Arabia. The biblical texts state that these caravans transported gum tragacanth, ointments, and labdanum. The Assyrian tablets and archaeology show that the caravan routes linking Arabia to the Levant coast went through the kingdom of Judah. This trade, which required many camels, reached its height in the 7th century BC. The caravans described in the story of Joseph, the son of the patriarch Jacob, therefore refer to a reality of the 7th century when the Assyrian Empire dominated the tiny kingdom of Judah.
So now that we look at Genesis, we know that Genesis does not describe the background of the 18th century. We are not in the Middle Bronze Age. There are enough anachronisms there about the Philistines, about the camels, that show us that we are not in an environment of the Middle Bronze. Instead, it is clear that we are in the 7th century BC. All the details, or many of the details in Genesis, fit perfectly the 7th century BC. So we have already answered one question, when? But there's still another question, why? We need to look at the authors of Genesis and ask the question, why did they tell the story of Genesis in this way?
The fact that the biblical texts state that Abraham left Mesopotamia for the Holy Land tells us nothing about the authors of the text. Our investigation will therefore now turn to the ultimate destination of his migration.
According to the biblical story, Abraham arrived from the north. He traveled through important sites in the north, but finally came to settle in Hebron. His settlement in Hebron was, in fact, confirmed by Abraham's acquisition of a tomb from the inhabitants of the area.
The names of biblical places attracted the attention of a German researcher who in the 1940s made an inventory of all the places where the patriarch stories took place. His name was Martin Noth. The Bible tells us that Abraham, a nomad, bought some land near Hebron in which to die, but also in which to live. The story tells of the appearance in an oak grove in Mamre of 3 of God's messengers who announced to Abraham's wife, who has been barren up until then, that she was to have a child. God appeared to Abraham under the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at his tent door at noontide. And lifting up his eyes, he saw, and behold, 3 men stood before him. Hebron and Mamre are located in the center of Canaan, at the heart of its rocky hills. Continuing his geographical reading of the Bible, Martin Noth became interested in the second patriarch, Isaac, the son of Sarah and Abraham. Isaac played a role in a very famous scene. Responding to a call from God, Abraham agreed to sacrifice Isaac, only to be replaced at the very last moment by an animal. The Bible tells us that Isaac was a shepherd living in the semi-arid south of Canaan. Martin Noth then turned to the third patriarch, Jacob. The biblical text tells us that he had to go to the north, to the site of his original family, in order to choose a wife. On his return journey, he entered into battle with an angel near a river that runs in the northeast of the country. According to the Bible, it was during the combat with God's angel that he received a new name, Israel, he who battles with God. Other texts relating to him are situated in the mountainous regions of the north of Canaan. The geography of the 3 patriarchs led Martin Noth to suggest a reading of the Bible that was different to the traditional one.
On the basis of these geographical sites, it is understandable that an attempt was made to link them to each other. As history developed, an understanding was sought of how these groups of humans related to each other. This led to a sort of patriarchal genealogy with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It was quite obvious that there were originally 3 quite separate traditions. The patriarchs were in fact not related. In the north, the story of Jacob was told. In Hebron, the story of Abraham. And in Beersheba, the story of Isaac. The idea that these 3 patriarchs were from one and the same family was, in fact, an invention after the fact by those who wrote the Bible. They wanted to show that there was a link between these 3 patriarchs, whereas in fact there was none.
Does this testify to a diversity in the oral traditions or in those of the texts? As of the 19th century, German biblical exegesis revealed that Genesis contained a number of stories of various origins that were woven together. Some were linked to the kingdom in the north, Israel, and others to the kingdom in the south, Judah.
So there are 3 different traditions set on the background of 3 different geographical zones. And the question is, why Abraham in the center? Why Abraham is put first? The answer is clear. We are in Jerusalem and Judah in the 7th century, in the period of the Judahite kingdom. So, regardless whether the patriarchs are historical or mythical, the most important fact is that the background of the story shows us that we are in the 7th century, in Judah, in Jerusalem, and the people who wrote this decided to put Abraham first as the founder of the family, as the center of the story, and by that also Judah as the center of the universe.
The Bible contains many long genealogies, lists of generations and family alliances that define territories and structure time.
The history of the patriarchs in the Bible is also a family history. Abraham was not only Isaac's father, he was also Ishmael's father, who was at the origin of all Arab tribes. And Isaac is not only Jacob's father, he is also Esau's father. And then Abraham is also Lot's uncle. This means that all the different peoples, clans, and tribes that live in Canaan and in Cis and Transjordan are linked by being descendants of Abraham. So all these people are presented as being part of one great family, with the problems faced by all families, but also the idea of a profound link between all these different peoples.
According to the biblical texts, many of the peoples and neighboring kingdoms are related to Judah. The long family saga of the Bible, as in any extended family tree, weaves the links that unite these peoples. But it also does more than that.
And what we see in the figure of Abraham is a symbolic representation of the birth of the nation. Because at the time of the writing of the Bible, the history of the people of Israel was not considered to be history in the sense that we understand it, of years, of periods, of particular historical events. It was seen more as the history of a family. And of course, the father of the family, the founder of the family, is a person of great significance. And throughout all the stories of Abraham, we see symbolic representations of the places of importance of Judah, of the kinds of relationships with other people that made Judean history.
The story of the patriarchs is the first pillar of what would later become Judaism, and that is common roots. According to Jewish tradition, the group known as the people of Israel is made up of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In their eyes, belonging to a people and to a religion is one and the same thing. Our investigation has taken us forward a great step. The facts we have gathered allow us to establish the period in which the stories of the patriarchs were first written and provides a geographical framework for this work. The region of Judah in the 7th century BC. But these books of stone have not finished raising questions about the work of paper. Did the Exodus, a central event in the Old Testament, really take place? Did those who were called the Hebrews go to Egypt? And did they leave under the command of a certain Moses? What role has been played by the law in this story? These questions will be the subject of our investigation in the second episode of our series. The Old Testament is a mysterious and complex work. It contains a set of rules and requirements that form the basis of both a religion and a civilization, Judaism. But it is also a historical work that tells the story of the ancient Israelites. In the previous episode, we learned that the story of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was put into writing for the first time in the 7th century BC in the Kingdom of Judah. Two researchers, Neil Silberman and Israel Finkelstein, put forward that hypothesis. But what about the other great stories of the Bible? Many of the vestiges discovered in the sites of Canaan are the remains of a sophisticated civilization, that of Egypt, an all-pervasive presence. Do these objects bear any relation to one of the most famous stories of the Old Testament, that of the conflict between Moses and the Pharaoh? What are they able to tell us about ancient Egypt? The biblical text explains that the descendants of the patriarchs came to live in Egypt, where they remained for 430 years. The story of their liberation by Moses and their journey through the wilderness is told in the second book of the Bible, the Exodus. But did this Exodus actually take place? The Israelites' long sojourn in Egypt, their enslavement and liberation, and the law received by Moses represent the core of the second book of the Bible. The Bible tells us that under the leadership of this exceptional man, Moses, the Hebrew people returned to the land that had been promised to their ancestors. Our investigation will begin in Lausanne, in the library of the theology department to be exact. Thomas Romer is a biblical scholar. He will be accompanying us in our investigation of these texts. In order to understand the role played by Egypt in the Bible, we have to go back to the circumstances surrounding the arrival of Jacob's sons in that country.
Egypt is omnipresent in the Hebrew Bible. It is often a land of welcome. Abraham went there because of the famine in Canaan, as did Jacob and his son Joseph later on. It was also a land of asylum, attracting many political refugees. They always had relations with Egypt. Sometimes those relations were complicated, sometimes they were simple, but there were no real ideological issues, because in fact, there was not much talk in the Bible of the gods of Egypt. So what is important with Egypt is that it was constantly in the minds of all the biblical authors.
Joseph's story in Egypt begins at the end of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. Sold by his brothers to caravan drivers on their way to Egypt, he was bought by an officer and introduced into the pharaoh's court, where he became the Grand Vizier. The Bible tells the story of his remarkable fate. In powerful and centralized Egypt, where royal propaganda played a critical role, nothing went unrecorded. Everything relating to the administrative functioning of the empire was noted down, from major events to the state's day-to-day running. Does this huge collection of hieroglyphics contain any clues as to Joseph's power, or at least the presence of the Israelites in Egypt? In order to answer that question, our investigators have to go to Egypt. Neil Silberman is in the country that all archaeologists dream about. A millennial civilization, magnificently preserved monuments. And in the heart of Cairo, an obligatory visit for our historian, an imperial building placed under the auspices of Champollion, the man who unraveled the mysteries of the hieroglyphics. He'll be meeting here with Jean-Pierre Cotigiani, a French Egyptologist.
When you look at a map of Egypt, it's obvious that it couldn't be anywhere else. In any case, you have the Suez Canal here, what is known as the Suez Canal today.
The Bible tells a very clear story of Jacob's family coming down to Egypt at a time of famine. Are there other important sources in Egyptian inscriptions and pictures of people from Canaan coming down to Egypt in a time of famine?
Certain people built careers there, people who held important positions. So the story of Joseph becoming a minister in the Pharaoh's service is quite plausible. I prefer not to use the word Pharaoh because we should really say King of Egypt. As you know, the word Pharaoh comes from the Bible. The Egyptians themselves never called their kings pharaohs, except very late in the period. In any case, there were people in the king's entourage who were Semites, who had been naturalized. They took on Egyptian names, and some of them built brilliant careers there.
Paintings in the ancient necropolis of Beni Hassan show Semites who had come to Egypt, most likely for trade reasons.
These show details of women with dresses that are not at all Egyptian, with these patterns here. The faces are quite typical of how the Egyptians saw the Semites, with long pointy beards and thicker hair.
But traders were not the only ones attracted to Egypt. The land of Canaan was subject to very dry seasons and irregular rainfalls, resulting in frequent famines. Herders and farmers had no other choice but to go to Egypt to work as laborers and take advantage of a more hospitable land. That hospitality was a gift of the Nile, a river that is both the soul of Egypt and its life source. Throughout biblical antiquity, Egypt acted as a magnet for those who came from arid lands, a land of refuge that was a source of fascination, as are most lands of plenty.
So how do we go from the story of Joseph, who was doing so well in Egypt, to the description of Egypt we find at the beginning of the book of Exodus, where suddenly Israel finds itself in a situation of oppression and slavery? This transition, in fact, occurs at the end of Joseph's story, because Joseph sends for Jacob and all his family. And in fact, it's the Israelites who expanded and grew in number. The book of Exodus opens with the following finding. A new Pharaoh came to power who no longer knew Joseph or what he had achieved. So all of a sudden, the picture changes, and we find ourselves in a state of oppression. On the one hand, the Egyptians wanted to retain their workers, but at the same time, they were afraid. They tried all sorts of methods to get rid of them, as is related in the biblical text. Or the more we oppress them, the more they are fruitful and multiply.
The Bible refers to the names of two cities that the Israelites apparently built, Pithom and Ramses. Egyptian documents confirm that a city by the name of Pi-Ramses was built in the Nile Delta in the 13th century BC, under Pharaoh Ramses II. From the 1920s onwards, archaeological missions began looking for the remains of that city, located east of the delta in Kontir. The Bible suggests the existence of significant imperial monuments. However, researchers have been disappointed by the results. The city of Ramses does in fact appear to have existed, but very few vestiges have been found.
Who was this king?
Ramses II.
Today, the site has once again become farming land. But archaeologists have succeeded in finding the solution to the enigma. The city of Ramses was abandoned just after its construction when one of the branches of the Nile dried up. A few decades later, its monuments were taken apart and the stones were reused in the construction of a new capital, Tanis, situated a few dozen kilometers away. So far, nothing appears to contradict the fact that Ramses II was the impressive builder pharaoh that we read about in the Bible. The same Ramses II that Moses pleaded with in the name of God and his ancestors to let his people go. In the Bible, the life of Moses begins as in a myth. His mother set him afloat in the river Nile in order to escape the authorities' order of death of all firstborn Israelites. He was taken in by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian noble. One day he saw an Egyptian strike an Israelite slave. He killed him and fled to the desert. There, the God of Israel ordered him to free his people and to guide them to the promised land. After hesitating for a while, he accepted the mission and returned to the court to impose the will of the God of Israel on the Pharaoh.
Moses defied the Pharaoh. What did that defiance symbolize? It showed that Yahweh, the God who sent Moses to the Pharaoh, was more powerful than all that the king of Egypt symbolized. When Moses came to see the Pharaoh asked who this God Yahweh was. He had never heard of him and considered him as the minor god of an Oriental people that was of no consequence. But little by little, he realized that this Yahweh was in fact more powerful than the whole of the Egyptian pantheon.
But the Pharaoh continued in his refusal. As a result, Egypt was struck by the 10 plagues. These plagues forced the Pharaoh to change his mind and let the Israelites go.
According to the biblical story, the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, not counting children.
The Israelites left Egypt in the middle of the night and crossed the Red Sea. The Egyptian army was swallowed up in its waters. Moses liberated an enslaved people from under the yoke of a great empire. So much for the story. But what of the historical facts? According to the text, the Exodus occurred 480 years before the construction of Solomon's temple, that is, in the 15th century BC. But the reference in the Bible to a city by the name of Pi-Ramses led researchers to place the Exodus in the 13th century at the earliest, a period where we find the first pharaohs bearing the name Ramses. An archaeological vestige held by the Museum of Cairo makes it possible to determine a chronology for the Exodus on the basis of historical data. It was discovered in 1896 in the funerary temple of Ramses II's son, Pharaoh Meneptah. The stele describes the military campaign led by Meneptah against Canaan. It provides a list of the cities and people that were fought and conquered.
At line 27, at the very bottom of the stele, we find a word that corresponds exactly with that of Israel. Israel is destroyed and its seed is no more. It is this idea of a community, of a people, that is rendered in the hieroglyph of the man and the woman, the determinative with the plural, which is therefore Israel. It is the only reference to Israel in the whole of Egyptian literature, be it historical, religious, or literary, that we are aware of. Only once is Israel mentioned in all the Egyptian texts, whereas the Bible refers to Misraim or Egypt about 700 times.
An actual reference then, albeit the only one we have. We know the date at which the stele was erected, 1207 BC. At that time, Israel was already established in Canaan, so the Exodus could not have occurred before this date. So to summarize, Semites were definitely to be found in Egypt. Pharaoh Ramses II was the father of Meneptah, and the 13th century seems to be a plausible time period. If we leave aside errors in the chronology of the Bible, the Exodus therefore could have occurred. What was the itinerary that was taken? The Bible tells us that in order to flee, the children of Israel had the choice of two routes, one in the north, which was direct, and one in the south, which crossed a mountainous desert. Which one did they choose? In order to find out, Neil Silberman is going to meet with Donald Redford, an Egyptologist who is specialized in the Bible, at his excavation in Mendes in the Delta.
Hi, Don.
Hi, Neil.
Great to see you.
Good to see you. How was the trip?
Terrific.
Oh, that's great. We expected you a bit earlier, but
well,
the best laid plans, I guess.
I guess. I hear you're having a great season here.
Oh, yes. This is one of the best. I'd like to show you the site. Shall we go and see it?
Love to.
Just in the places where the Bible describes the exodus of the Israelites as they left Egypt, were there fortifications? Was there a military presence there that would have encountered these fleeing Israelites?
Oh, yes. All over the eastern delta and in the Sinai and up in the Negev and further north, there were permanent Egyptian garrisons and garrison points, checkpoints. In fact, the Bedou were constantly under watch by the Egyptian paramilitary police along the borders.
A carving at the Karnak Temple attests to the existence of a sophisticated system of garrisons that ensured the logistics of a route that followed the north coast of Sinai. It was a strategic route for the Egyptians that led into Mesopotamia and Anatolia. A fleeing multitude could not have taken it without being spotted and stopped by one of its garrisons. This left them with the southern and more arid route, the one that is most in keeping with the biblical story. The Bible tells how, after having camped in the desert for almost 3 months, the Israelites received the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. They then headed off towards the northeast to the land of Canaan. At that point, the biblical text tells us, they reached the oasis of Kadesh Barnea, located between the Sinai and Negev deserts. It is here that they spent many years after refusing to enter the Holy Land. The oasis was thoroughly excavated during the 1950s and 1970s. No remains from the 13th century, which is believed to be the period of the Exodus, were found at the site. Modern archaeological techniques enable us to pinpoint the tiniest remains left behind by simple herdsmen, and yet no trace of the Israelites' long stay in the area is to be found. The absence of any evidence of their journey through the wilderness in either this oasis or anywhere else in the Sinai Peninsula is one of the enigmas of the Exodus story.
How can you explain the possibility of such a large group as described in the Exodus story actually going out of Egypt? Is that possible?
Well, I couldn't explain it. Nothing of that shows up in the archaeological or textual record. And one might argue that's an argument from silence, admittedly, but nonetheless, we know so much about that period that not to find even a single blip on the radar screen, as it were, it would be fatal to that theory. Moreover, The biblical account has 600,000 weapon-bearing males leaving Egypt in the Exodus. That would probably translate into 2 million souls. Can you imagine 2 million people leaving a country of the size of Egypt, which had only a population of 3.5 million at the time? That would have made a huge hole in the social and economic system that certainly would have shown up in the records. It would have resulted almost immediately in a downsizing economically and socially that would certainly have disrupted the empire irreparably. Nothing of that sort is found in the record, not a thing. I couldn't see the Exodus as described in the Bible as occurring in the 13th century.
So we're talking about something that isn't quite history, but there are a number of specific geographical terms. Can they give us any clue to when this was written?
The geographical clues can, in fact, help to date the person who put this down. That's true. When one does that, one comes up with a fairly good impression of what the writer knew and the geography that he was familiar with. And that would help to plug him in terms of chronology. When did he live? Yes.
When was that time?
Well, Pithom, as I say, has been identified as the city called Per Atum, the House of Atum. This was built by Pharaoh Necho II around 600 BC, certainly not before 605 BC. That's one item. Going out of Egypt, you have such names as Etam, Pi Hahirot, Baal Tzafon. All of these are known from the later geography of Egypt. They weren't around, many of them, in the New Kingdom when the story is supposed to have taken place. I would see the Saite period, what we call the Saite, that's the 26th dynasty from 664 to 525 BC, as a period, a kind of an optimal period for the general background of the story as we have it in Exodus. At any rate, we've limited it to 7th, 6 centuries before Christ.
So, as in our investigation of the patriarchs, both the clues gathered in the field and the texts point in the same direction. Certain stories, including the Exodus, started to be written down in the 7th century BC. Neil Silberman has returned to Megiddo. He is discussing these new elements with Israel Finkelstein. Whatever the possible historical sources that inspired the Exodus saga, the story does not describe the Egypt of the 13th century BC. The investigation of this biblical story once again leads us to the 7th century. What were the reasons for writing down this text at that time? We have to broaden our historical perspective. In the 9th century and during most of the 8th century, Canaan was divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. These kingdoms were located between two of the greatest empires of the Near East. In the south, Egypt, whose power and might we have seen evidence of. Canaan was obviously a strategic area for this immemorial kingdom, which had significant regional ambitions. And in the northeast, Assyria, the great Mesopotamian empire of the time. In its desire for regional hegemony, it was obviously and aggressively one of Egypt's rivals. Israel and Judah, these twin kingdoms would ultimately be caught up in that rivalry. But they would not share the same destiny.
In the late 8th century BC, the Assyrians show on the scene. They wipe out the northern kingdom, take over its territory. Torrent of refugees come to the south, to Jerusalem, to Judah. And that puts a heavy burden on the people of Judah and Jerusalem, because now they are the only Israelite nation left.
Our investigation will now move to Jerusalem, capital of the Kingdom of Judah. It is here that the biblical stories of Egypt, Moses, and the Exodus into the desert would be woven during the 7th century. Unraveling those stories is no mean feat and requires careful analysis. Jerusalem is a city of hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Each man and woman, and also each stone, carries the weight of a sacred story. Undertaking excavations here is quite a challenge. Nevertheless, surprising discoveries have been made thanks to the determination of archaeologists.
This wall was built in the late 8th century BC in the time of King Hezekiah. At that time, Jerusalem grew dramatically in population and in size, 10 times bigger than before, in a matter of 25, 30 years, 40 years, something like that. And that was because of the torrent of refugees who came from the north after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel by the Assyrians, came to Judah and settled here. And this area, which was outside the old city of the Bronze and Iron Age, became populated. And then, because of the Assyrian threat, Hezekiah decided to fortify it. And he built this huge fortification, huge wall, to surround the new quarter in the western hill of Jerusalem.
During the reign of this king, Hezekiah, Jerusalem underwent a metamorphosis. From a modest town of 6 hectares, the city was transformed into an urbanized zone of about 60 hectares, protected by an impressive wall. The city appeared to be preparing for a battle, undoubtedly with the Assyrian Empire. The archaeologist Ronnie Reich has been involved in excavations here for many years. He is a specialist on the city of Jerusalem. In order to appreciate how seriously the Assyrian threat was taken by the small kingdom of Judah, we have to enter into the bowels of the city. Jerusalem's only permanent source of water flowed outside the city walls and could not be accessed if the city was under siege. To maintain supplies to Jerusalem, King Hezekiah launched an extraordinary project for a tunnel that would bring water to reservoirs situated inside the ramparts.
And the tunnel goes from here for over 500 meters, cut from both sides. They met in the middle, all in the rock.
Well, this is a real engineering achievement, because two groups which were cutting in a tunnel which is not straight but has an S-shaped outline. They went like this and met here. They could have cut one next to the other and one above the other. Two types of arrows, and they avoided both of them. And we still don't have an adequate explanation how this was done, but this certainly is.
But we have the inscription of the two groups working with the axes and hewing the rock, and then they meet in the great moment when they hear each other.
Carved into the rock, this inscription in ancient Hebrew commemorates the meeting of the two teams. The Bible, it seems, also refers to this event in the Book of Kings.
This ancient Hebrew inscription is really one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for the rise of Judah as a kingdom. So it represents both the engineering that was possible by the kingdom and also the attempt of the kingdom to record that act in an official way, in an official inscription. And so this really brings us to a time when the kingdom was centralized, when Jerusalem was a city that was administered by royal officials that had the power and the level of literacy to record their achievements and their history.
In this way, a tiny kingdom lost in the hills of Judah became a genuine state in a very short period of time. It probably hoped to play an important role in the region, but its fate was already sealed.
Après la chute du Royaume du Nord,
after the fall of the kingdom in the north, only one buffer state remained between Assyria and Egypt, the tiny state of Judah.
Et ce qui s'est passé, c'est que les Judéens ont
The
oscillé
people of Judah wavered between the idea that they should submit to the Assyrians
se soumettre aux Assyriens et puis,
and the
d'un
idea
autre côté,
that they could remain
l'idée qu'ils
independent
pourraient bien,
with the
rester
support of Egypt.
indépendants en s'appuyant sur les Égyptiens. Et dans
At
ce
some
mouvement
point,
de
they went
bascule,
too far,
eh bien, il y a un moment où
and
ils sont allés trop
Sennacherib,
loin, et
Sargon's
donc,
son, decided to put an end to the
le fils de
situation.
Sargon a décidé d'en finir.
It was 701 BC. The new Assyrian king, Sennacherib, marched on Judah at the head of a huge army. When they reached Lachish, the second largest city of the kingdom, they laid siege to it. Today, Lachish is an artificial tell or mound. In the 8th century BC, it was one of Judah's administrative capitals and the site of a memorable battle. Evacuations carried out along its fortifications have revealed evidence of a violent confrontation. David Usishkin, who heads the excavations, is a professor of archaeology at the Tel Aviv University.
The Assyrians, when they came to Judah, Sennacherib came to Lachish. He didn't go to Jerusalem. Now, why did he come to Lachish and not straight to Jerusalem? In my view, he wanted to show an exemplary conquest. He wanted to show the people of the country what he can do and what he can do to Jerusalem. And in my view, he decided to destroy this fortress of King Hezekiah, and then he sent army to Jerusalem to negotiate with him and to come to some agreement with him.
Despite its powerful fortifications, Lachish was defeated. To avoid the same result in Jerusalem, Judah paid a levy and became one of Assyria's vassal states. But as is shown by the archaeological evidence, this submission to its powerful neighbor in the north led, paradoxically, to an unprecedented economic boom. Excavations corresponding to this period in all the sites tell the same story and describe the same phenomenon. Judah, controlled by the Assyrian authorities, participated in Arabian trade and in the production of oil on a very large scale. At the same time, a genuine government was set up. Our books of stone have shed light on the birth of a state.
Lamelech, belonging to the king, the city of Hebron. Lamelech, Socho, belonging to the king, the city of Socho in the Shephelah. It represents developed administration. First of all, because the storages are of about the same volume, the same quantity. They are standardized. And secondly, the seal impressions too are standardized. So what you have here is evidence for some sort of state administration. A person, you know, a family, just somebody out there in the village doesn't do things like that. So all the evidence fall together to the same conclusion. Full-blown state in Judah for the first time in the late 8th century.
This new state of affairs would modify the geopolitical landscape of the region. The Assyrians, overcome by internal problems, left the Levant around 630 BC.
The end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was characterized by serious problems, in particular in Babylonia. The majority of Assyria's military forces were therefore focused on this territory. As a result, the Assyrians were perceived as being much less present, much less available in the surrounding areas, which obviously made this an attractive time for liberation movements.
With the Assyrians weakened, an audacious project began to take root in Judah to conquer the territory of the ancient kingdom of Israel. It is in this context that the confrontation between Egypt and the Exodus, as it is described in the Bible, begins to make sense. A king by the name of Josiah reigned in Jerusalem. He was the great-grandson of Hezekiah and dreamed of a great pan-Israelite kingdom, a truly unified kingdom. The Bible is exceedingly generous in its praise of this king.
Never before had there been a king like Josiah, who turned to Yahweh with all his heart and soul and might, obeying all the laws of Moses. That is what the Hebrew Bible had to say of Josiah. He's perhaps not a very well-known king, but he was quite extraordinary according to the Bible.
The authors of the biblical text tell how Josiah ordered work to be carried out in the Temple of Jerusalem. This is a very important point in terms of our investigation.
During these works, the great priest discovered a book. He announced that the book of the law has been discovered. The book was given to the king, who, on reading it, tore off all his clothes as a sign of mourning or consternation. He then undertook a major reform which included the prohibition of all other places of worship, thereby making Jerusalem the only legitimate place of worship.
Was a book really discovered, or was this just a pretext to launch a project that had been envisaged for some time? No one knows. But as a result of this discovery, Josiah launched the most radical reform in the kingdom's history. Experts believe that this book, which has been given the name the Book of the Covenant, was in fact the Book of Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Pentateuch. The reform gave priority to the laws that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai and centralized the region in Jerusalem. But was this Josiah's only objective?
Josiah needed centralization of power, strong administration, complete control of the state. One way to do that was to centralize cult, to do this reform of cult, which would lead back to the idea, to the pan-Israelite idea, that all Israelites must worship one God in one place, in Jerusalem. This is how, if you do this, and you demolish the cult places in the countryside, definitely you control better the economy, you control better the state, you better control the state, and you can achieve your goals in a better and faster way.
Josiah therefore had a political objective, the creation of a great unified kingdom. But the winds of history would once again turn. After a long period of dormancy, Egypt renewed with its imperial ambitions. Pharaoh Psammetichus I also had a dream: to return Egypt to the glory of its former pharaohs, such as Ramses II. Egypt would take control of part of Canaan that had been relinquished by Assyria.
For Josiah, Egypt was not only it was the real threat. It was the only obstacle in front of him which could have prevented him for fulfilling his ideology of the Great Israel. Egypt was there, and at the same time it had its own ideology, its own dreams, its own wishful thinking, and it was the only obstacle.
Judah and Egypt were on the verge of a military conflict. What happened then? Did Josiah intend to use the text to convey a message of hope? A story that would show that a small people could triumph over the greatest of empires, as Israel had triumphed over Egypt when its people were led by a great man with the backing of God and the law?
The story of Exodus is the story of a liberation that goes beyond the flight from Egypt. In order for the liberation to be complete, it was necessary to receive the law. In the Pentateuch, this law is received outside of any political institution, whether it be royalty or the state. It is thus a law that is given to the people by Moses.
Implicitly compared to Moses in the biblical story, a man would take on the role of both liberator and of lawmaker, King Josiah. For the law would play a central role in uniting the Israelites, and would later unite all those who made a claim to Judaism. The law that was given to the people as it appeared in the Ten Commandments and in Deuteronomy would put into writing the bond that existed between Jews and their God. The law seen as a covenant, a holy covenant. Since that time, this law and its transmission and study constitutes the second pillar of Judaism. A religion unites a people and its God, as in the time of Josiah, by a covenant that is read and interpreted for all time. Our investigation has shown us the role of the patriarchs in the biblical story. This time, it has established the second pillar of what was to become Judaism, a society united by its laws, with the concepts of oppression and liberation as its background. In the next episode, our investigation will lead us to a rereading of the story of the conquest of Canaan, and will see us following in the footsteps of the Bible's great kings, David and Solomon.